With a heavy heart, she returned to Adi's side, praying that the fever would break on its own. That night, as Amara sat by Adi's bed, cooling her forehead with a damp cloth, she felt a deep sense of helplessness wash over her. She had always been strong, always found a way to provide for her children, but this time she felt powerless. She could see the life slipping away from her daughter, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Hello viewers. Welcome to our channel African Tales by Abby. Please support us by giving this video a thumbs up, share, comment and subscribe. Thank you. In the small town of Umuahia, where the sun bathed the dusty roads in gold and the air was thick with the scent of blooming hibiscus, there lived a woman named Amara. Her name meant grace, and she embodied it in every sense. She moved through life with quiet dignity, even as the weight of her burdens grew heavier with each passing day. Amara was the wife of Chinedu, a man known for his wealth as much as for his stinginess. Chinedu owned several businesses in the town, including a popular bar where he spent most of his evenings, drinking and laughing with friends and strangers alike. The townspeople often wondered how a man with so much could give so little to his family. But Chinedu's wealth was his own, and he guarded it jealously. In their home, a large house with walls that seemed to close in on Amara with each passing day, there was little joy. The house was richly furnished, with expensive rugs and ornate furniture, but it lacked the warmth of a true home. The children, Adis, Obina, and Ngozi, felt this absence acutely. While other children in the town ran through the streets with full bellies and bright smiles, Chinedu's children were thin, their eyes dull with hunger. Amara did her best to stretch the little money Chinedu gave her for household expenses, but it was never enough. She would often go without food so that her children could eat, and even then, the meals were meager, small portions of gari and okra soup, with barely enough fish or meat to go around. The children would eat in silence, knowing better than to ask for more. "Mommy, will we have more food tomorrow?" Ngozi, the youngest, would sometimes ask, her large eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Amara's heart would break a little more each time she had to answer. "We will, my love. Mommy will make sure of it," she would say, forcing a smile. But deep down, she knew that tomorrow would bring the same struggle. Chinedu, however, seemed oblivious to the suffering in his own home. Each night, he would leave for his bar, his pockets full of money that he would spend on drinks and the company of women who fawned over him, eager to take whatever scraps he offered. Amara knew of his infidelities, but she had long since stopped trying to confront him. It was pointless. Chinedu would brush off her concerns with a wave of his hand, telling her that she worried too much. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew long, Amara stood at the kitchen sink, washing the few dishes they had used for dinner. Adis, her eldest daughter, entered the room, moving slowly as if each step took all the strength she had. "Mommy, I don't feel well," Adis said, her voice barely above a whisper. Amara turned to her daughter and was immediately alarmed by what she saw. Adis' usually bright brown eyes were dull, and her skin, once glowing with youth, was now pale and clammy. Amara rushed to her side, placing a hand on her forehead. "You're burning up," Amara said, her voice trembling. "Come, let me take you to bed." She guided Adis to her small room, where her daughter collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling with fever. Amara quickly covered her with a thin blanket and sat beside her, her mind racing. She knew this was no ordinary illness. Adis had been complaining of headaches for days, and now the fever was making her delirious. As she sat there, watching her daughter shiver and mourn in her sleep, Amara knew she had to do something. She needed to get Addis to a hospital, but she had no money. Chinedu controlled all their finances, and he had never been generous when it came to spending on his family. When Chinedu returned home later that night, reeking of alcohol and cheap perfume, Amara approached him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Chinedu, Addis is very sick," she said, her voice laced with desperation. "We need to take her to the hospital." Chinedu waved her off without even looking at her. "Hospitals are too expensive, Amara. We don't have that kind of money." "But she's burning up with fever," Amara cried, her eyes pleading. "She needs proper medical care. Please, Chinedu, she's our daughter." Chinedu finally looked at her, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "You're overreacting, as usual. I'll get some drugs from the chemist tomorrow. That should be enough." Amara wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him see the severity of the situation, but she knew it was futile. Chinedu was a man set in his ways, and nothing she said would change his mind. With a heavy heart, she returned to Addis' side, praying that the fever would break on its own. That night, as Amara sat by Addis' bed, cooling her forehead with a damp cloth, she felt a deep sense of helplessness wash over her. She had always been strong, always found a way to provide for her children, but this time she felt powerless. She could see the life slipping away from her daughter, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As the hours passed, Addis' condition worsened. Her breathing became labored, and her small body was racked with tremors. Amara stayed by her side, holding her hand, whispering soothing words even as tears streamed down her face. She prayed silently, asking God to spare her daughter, to take her instead, but the only response she received was the oppressive silence of the night. By morning, Addis' fever had not broken. She was delirious, her eyes unfocused, her words nonsensical. Amara knew that time was running out, but still, Chinedu refused to take her to the hospital. He left early that morning, claiming he had important business to attend to, leaving Amara to watch over their dying daughter alone. As the day wore on, Addis' condition continued to decline. Amara had never felt so helpless in her life. She could only sit by her daughter's side, praying and crying, as the life slowly drained from Addis' frail body. It was late in the afternoon when Addis took her last breath. The moment was marked by a sudden stillness, as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge the passing of a pure and innocent soul. Amara was left alone in the quiet room, clutching her daughter's lifeless body, her heart shattered beyond repair. When Chinedu returned home that evening, the sight of his wife cradling their daughter's body did not move him. He stood in the doorway, his expression cold and indifferent. "What are you doing, Amara? You should have known this was coming. She was weak, like you," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Amara did not respond. She could not. Her world had ended the moment Addis took her last breath, and nothing Chinedu said or did could change that. The funeral was a small, somber affair. The townspeople whispered among themselves, casting pitying glances at Amara as she stood by her daughter's grave, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from days of crying. Chinedu stood beside her, his face a mask of indifference, as if the loss of his daughter meant nothing to him. In the days that followed, the house grew even more silent. The absence of Addis' laughter and presence felt keenly by everyone except Chinedu. He continued with his life as if nothing had happened, leaving Amara to pick up the pieces of her shattered family. Amara's grief was overwhelming, but she knew she had to stay strong for her remaining children, Obinna and Ngozi. They needed her now more than ever, and she was determined not to let them suffer the same fate as Addis. But deep down, she knew that as long as they remained in Chinedu's house, their lives would always be in danger. Days turned into weeks after Addis' death, but the grief that weighed down on Amara's heart only grew heavier. The once vibrant household was now steeped in sorrow, with laughter and joy having been replaced by an eerie silence. The children, Obinna and Ngozi, clung to their mother, sensing the void left by their sister's passing. Obinna, the eldest son, was particularly affected. He was a bright boy, always eager to learn, always the one who tried to make his mother smile despite the harshness of their reality. But since Addis' death, Obinna had become withdrawn, his once lively spirit dampened by the overwhelming sadness in their home. Amara noticed the change in her son, and it broke her heart. She tried to comfort him, to tell him that things would get better, but the words felt hollow. She herself was barely holding on, the constant worry about her children's well-being gnawing at her day and night. Chinedu, on the other hand, seemed unfazed by the loss of his daughter. He continued with his life as if nothing had changed, spending his days at work and his nights at the bar, drinking and reveling with friends. The money he earned was still spent lavishly on himself, while his family was left to scrape by on the little he begrudgingly gave them. Amara's pleas for more money were met with the same cold indifference. "You need to learn how to manage what I give you," he would say, his tone dismissive. "I'm not made of money." It was the same refrain Amara had heard for years, but now it carried a sharper sting. She had lost a daughter because of his refusal to provide adequate care, and yet he showed no remorse, no guilt, nothing but contempt for her supposed inability to manage the household. One evening, as the children prepared for bed, Amara noticed Obinna moving sluggishly, his steps heavy as if each one required great effort. His usually bright eyes were dull, and he complained of a headache, much like Addis had done before her illness took a turn for the worse. A wave of panic washed over Amara. She couldn't lose another child. She simply couldn't bear it. "Obinna, come here," she said, trying to keep her voice steady as she pulled him close. She pressed her hand against his forehead and felt the heat radiating from his skin. "You're burning up." Obinna shrugged weakly, trying to be brave for his mother. "I'll be fine, Mommy. It's just a little headache." But Amara knew better. This was more than just a headache. The memories of Addis' illness came flooding back, the fear gripping her heart like a vice. She couldn't let history repeat itself. She had to do something. When Chinedu returned home that night, Amara was waiting for him. She was tired, both physically and emotionally, but desperation had given her a new resolve. "Chinedu, Obinna is sick," she said the moment he walked through the door. "We need to take him to the hospital." Chinedu sighed, already irritated. "Not this again, Amara. How many times do I have to tell you? Hospitals are a waste of money. Just give him some rest, and he'll be fine." "Please, Chinedu," Amara begged, her voice trembling with fear. "He's showing the same symptoms Addis did before she passed. I can't lose another child." Chinedu looked at her, his expression hardening. "You're overreacting, just like you did with Addis. I told you before, and I'll tell you again, he'll be fine. I'll get some drugs from the chemist tomorrow. That's all he needs." Amara felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. How could he be so blind, so callous? But she knew that arguing with him was pointless. He had made up his mind, and nothing she said would change it. That night, as Obinna slept fitfully, tossing and turning in his bed, Amara sat by his side, just as she had done with Addis. She held his hand, whispering soothing words, praying for a miracle. But the fear gnawed at her, the memories of Addis' final days haunting her every thought. Obinna's condition worsened over the next few days. His appetite disappeared, and he grew weaker with each passing hour. Amara tried to feed him, but he could barely keep anything down. His once strong, sturdy frame became frail, his skin taking on a sickly pallor. Amara was desperate. She couldn't stand to watch her son suffer, but Chinedu's refusal to take him to the hospital left her with few options. She tried to take him herself, but without money, the hospital turned her away. All she could do was continue to care for him at home, doing her best to keep him comfortable, even as she knew deep down that it wasn't enough. Chinedu's indifference during this time was like salt in an open wound. He would come home late, reeking of alcohol, barely acknowledging his sick son. Amara could see the growing resentment in Obinna's eyes, the way he looked at his father, as if trying to understand how a man could be so heartless. It was on a quiet, stifling afternoon that Obinna took his last breath. Amara was with him, just as she had been with Addis, holding his hand, tears streaming down her face as she whispered words of love and comfort. He was too weak to respond, but she knew he could hear her. She felt his hand go limp in hers, and a deep, anguished cry escaped her lips as the realization hit her: Obinna was gone. For the second time in as many months, Amara was left to bury a child. The funeral was small, attended only by a few close family members and neighbors. The whispers grew louder, the community now openly questioning Chinedu's actions, or rather, his lack of them. But Chinedu remained unmoved, standing at the graveside with the same cold indifference he had shown at Addis' funeral. The loss of Obinna was a blow from which Amara knew she would never fully recover. She had lost 2 of her children to illnesses that could have been treated, prevented even, if only Chinedu had cared enough to provide the necessary medical care. The grief was overwhelming, consuming her every thought, every moment. But as the days passed, that grief began to transform into something else: anger. It was a slow-burning anger, one that simmered beneath the surface, fueled by the memories of her children's suffering, by Chinedu's carelessness and neglect. Amara knew she couldn't stay in that house any longer. Not for herself, and certainly not for Ngozi, her only remaining child. She had to get out, had to protect what little she had left. And so, with a heavy heart, she began to plan her escape. She would return to her father's house, where she knew she would be welcomed, where Ngozi would be safe. It wouldn't be easy, and the thought of leaving everything behind was terrifying, but Amara knew it was the only way to save her daughter and herself. Amara's decision to leave Chinedu was not made lightly. She had endured years of neglect and emotional abuse, suffering in silence for the sake of her children. But now, with 2 of her precious children gone, she could no longer justify staying. Her survival, and that of her remaining daughter, depended on leaving. Over the next few weeks, Amara quietly began preparing for their departure. She had little to take with her, just a few clothes, some personal items, and a small amount of money she had managed to save over the years without Chinedu's knowledge. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get her and Ngozi to her father's house, where she knew they would find refuge. Amara's father, Pais, lived in a neighboring village, a place she hadn't visited in years due to Chinedu's insistence on isolating her from her family. but she knew her father's love for her had never wavered. He had always been a kind and caring man, and she was certain he would welcome her and Ngozi with open arms. The most challenging part of the plan was keeping it hidden from Chinedu. He was a man of routine, and any disruption to that routine would raise suspicions. Amara had to be careful, gathering their belongings little by little, hiding them in a place where Chinedu wouldn't notice. She also had to wait for the right moment to leave, a time when Chinedu would be away from the house for an extended period, giving her and Ngozi enough time to get away without being caught. Finally, the opportunity presented itself. One evening, Chinedu announced that he would be traveling to a nearby city for business and would be gone for a few days. Amara knew this was her chance. She spent the night in quiet anticipation, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. She had planned everything as carefully as she could, but there was still a lingering uncertainty, a fear that something might go wrong. The next morning, after Chinedu left, Amara wasted no time. She packed the last of their things, dressing Ngozi in her warmest clothes. The child, sensing her mother's urgency, remained quiet, her large eyes filled with a mix of confusion and trust. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew her mother was doing what was best for them. Amara left a brief note for Chinedu, though she doubted he would care. The note simply read, "We have gone. Do not look for us." It was all she could manage, her hands trembling as she wrote the words. She knew that Chinedu would likely react with anger or indifference, but it didn't matter. She was finally free. With Ngozi in tow, Amara set out on the journey to her father's house. The path was long and arduous, but Amara was driven by a determination she hadn't felt in years. As they walked, she told Ngozi stories of her childhood, of the village where they were going, trying to distract her from the fatigue and hunger they both felt. The journey took several hours, with Amara carrying Ngozi for much of the way when the little girl grew too tired to walk. The sun was setting by the time they finally reached the outskirts of the village. As they approached Pa Isa's house, a small but steady structure nestled among tall palm trees, Amara felt a surge of emotion. She hadn't seen her father in so long, and now here she was, returning to him broken and in desperate need of his help. Pa Isa was sitting on the veranda when he saw them approach. His eyes, once sharp and clear, had grown dim with age, but they widened in surprise when he recognized his daughter and granddaughter. Without a word, he stood up and hurried toward them, his heart pounding with a mixture of joy and concern. "Amara, my child," he exclaimed, embracing her tightly. "What are you doing here? Is everything all right?" Amara couldn't hold back the tears any longer. She collapsed into her father's arms, sobbing uncontrollably as years of pain and grief came pouring out. Pa Isa held her close, his own eyes filling with tears as he realized the depth of her suffering. "Hush, my daughter, hush," he said gently, stroking her hair. "You're safe now. You're home." Amara clung to her father, the weight of her burdens lifting slightly as she let herself be comforted by the one person who had always been there for her. After a few moments, she pulled back, wiping her tears as she looked at him. "Papa, I had to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Chinedu, he's not the man I thought he was. I've lost 2 of my children because of him. I couldn't stay any longer. I had to protect Ngozi." Pa Isa's expression hardened as he listened to his daughter's words. He had always had his doubts about Chinedu, but he had never imagined a man was capable of such cruelty. His heart ached for his daughter, and he vowed to do whatever it took to help her rebuild her life. "You did the right thing, Amara," he said firmly. "You're safe here. Both of you. Chinedu will not lay a hand on you or Ngozi again." Amara nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude and relief. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer alone. She had her father's support, and together, they would find a way to move forward. That night, as Amara lay in the small bed her father had prepared for her and Ngozi, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Ngozi slept soundly beside her, her tiny hand clutching her mother's, a look of contentment on her face. Amara watched her daughter sleep, her heart filled with a mixture of sorrow for what they had lost and hope for what they might yet gain. As she drifted off to sleep, Amara whispered a silent prayer of thanks. She had made it out. She had escaped the darkness that had consumed her life for so long. And now, in the safety of her father's house, she could begin the process of healing, of finding herself again, and of building a better future for her and her daughter.